Good afternoon to everyone, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to December meeting of our Seminarium Afrykanistyczne. And this time it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Wolbert Smidt, a specialist in history and social issues of the Horn of Africa from University in Jena and Mekelle University in Ethiopia. And Professor Smith will have a talk on propaganda and history in state politics, the case of Ethiopia and Eritrea. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. We can also have a shorter title in order to make clear what it is all about. I will speak about history narratives as a political tool, in short. History narratives as a political tool is something which is, of course, known as a subject. So this as itself is not new, but which is surprisingly new in a way is it as a discussion within the Horn of Africa. Within the Horn of Africa, many people mention it again and again, history is falsified, history is in the hands of the elites, history is in the hands of politicians, but it is not very deeply discussed within researcher circles and within circles, including Ethiopian researcher circles, who are not seeing it as a huge, let me call it, subject of research itself. It is rather, again, an instrument by itself, used by many people to say, so far we have heard the wrong history, now we are presenting the true history. So very often the idea that historical narratives are sort of political instruments or are instruments of manipulation, including manipulation of political emotions. This is very often used as an argument to reject a specific historical narrative. What is new, however, within the Horn of Africa, or let me say, not underlined strongly enough, is the fact that any historical narrative, especially in the political setting of the Horn of Africa, is very much an instrument within political discussion. An instrument within political discussion doesn't mean that historical narratives are necessarily wrong. The point is that historical narratives are chosen based on a specific political idea, political experience, or an interest of influencing a debate. So in any case, even very serious historical studies are very often and regularly seen as an instrument within a debate. And that's precisely what is not reflected largely. What is reflected is this long tradition of historical narratives, manipulations, and so, but it is always the other who is manipulating. It's always the other who is simplifying. It's always the other who is presenting the wrong history. And while I, for example, participating in historical debate, insist that specific historical observations are very well based on historical sources, I'm of course participating in this debate by presenting a tool of influencing the other. So by presenting historical facts as tools in a debate does not mean that these historical facts are falsified, but they are within a setting which can cause better understanding, certainly, in some cases, because historical facts, that's the positive and the beautiful thing with historical facts. They very often can help us to better understand complex situations. But on the other hand, the selection itself, the selection of historical facts and which one are presented first, is by itself creating emotions, is by itself creating a political framework. And that's the problem. As long as everyone is aware that historical perspectives are part of a debate in which different members of this debate are struggling to create a balance of the different checked information, it is fine. It is helping to understand the extreme complexity and plurality of perspectives and the plurality of sources and historical facts, which sometimes are very difficult to understand if you look at one set of facts and not at another set of facts, which may even contradict. But putting them together helps understanding complexities of situations. So in the sense of a debate where everyone puts in specific facts and findings from history, it is extremely fertile, extremely useful. But in a setting where only one is right and the other one is an instrument of manipulation of a specific debate, then there's no hope. This is not a debate. It is a setting of conflict. It's a setting of fighting. It's a setting of rejecting the other. So it's a setting which reproduces the big political conflicts and big political narratives which stand against each other and exclude each other, which we know so well from the last, I would say, 60, 70, 80 years in modern Ethiopia. So this was now a very short introduction into the main idea. So if I speak of historical narratives as political instruments, in short, it does not mean that these historical narratives are always wrong or always based on wrong perceptions of facts or even on real falsifications. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that it is quite a normal fact that historical perspectives based even on correct interpretation of sources are always based on selections. And the problem is always when this selection is used to reject all the others, all the other perspectives, and used as an instrument of conflict. And of course, the next level of escalation is if these historical facts, in quotation marks, are even not facts at all, but based on rumors, based on misunderstandings, sometimes just unprofessional work, sometimes based on interpretations which are the result of political ideas and not the result of real research on the ground. So we have, of course, historical narratives in the sense of good but selective research, but we also have historical narratives as simply narratives based on a long process of repeated falsifications, misunderstandings, and re-falsifications. Now, these were very general remarks. They are important because still today, within circles who work on history, we have this problem that we do not reflect enough, not sufficiently, the fact that the way we read history, the way we analyze even very dry facts, are based on perspectives, and these perspectives are part of debates. And as long as we accept the idea that these debates are based on specific selections, on specific social interests, cultural interests, maybe political interests, as long as we are aware of it and accept the other perspectives as completing the picture, we are totally fine. We are in this dynamics of exchange. If we reject this as a fact, that scholarship works like that, the exchange on views works like that, we are immediately within a political struggle, within a political fight of excluding each other. So I repeated very shortly the main idea to make sure that this starting point is understood. I have understood that some of the participants are younger students who have no experience in the region. Others are experienced colleagues who know the region very well. But I want to base my presentation on some explanations, general explanations, which help to understand within which setting I'm talking. So my starting point is Ethiopia and its neighbors, with focus on Ethiopia and Eritrea, which are in the Horn of Africa, which are in northeastern Africa, depends again on the selection of the geographical term. And Ethiopia is generally seen and known internationally as a country which is very ancient, whose historical roots are, that's the formula usually used, reaching 3,000 years back. That's the formula. Ethiopia is one of the most densely populated African states. The number of inhabitants of Ethiopia is about, depends on the statistics and the authority who's talking, but it's generally assumed to have about 110 to 120 million inhabitants. So Ethiopia, together with Nigeria, to some degree, Sudan plus South Sudan, belongs to the biggest and most important countries of Africa. And there's already one interesting bias. If we know that a country has an ancient history, we tend to think, plus linked with the fact that it's a big country with a high number of inhabitants, we already unconsciously imagine this country as ancient as it is. We overlook that every region in the world, without any exception, and I repeat, without any exception, I include Egypt, I include China, has gone through incredible changes, territorial changes, movements of populations, migration into all directions, breakdown of cultural knowledge, change of language. So that the fact that in one specific region of a specific country, there is an ancient tradition which partially has continued until today through language, through writing systems, through, and to some degree, manuscript traditions and similar, does not mean that the country is ancient. It's a widespread and a bit surprising misunderstanding. Any country is ancient because human beings, since ancient times, form societies, and these societies usually do not disappear totally, but create traditions which are continued. These traditions are sometimes simply forgotten, at least in the official discourse, but we do not find any country which did not go through breakdowns, interruptions of traditions, interruptions of identities, and reinvention of identities. So there's just no exception. So this notion of an ancient country in comparison to new countries is, from a strictly historical point of view, linked with modern cultural studies, cultural history, utter nonsense. So I hope to have clarified something in the beginning. If we speak of Ethiopia as an ancient country, it is based already on a specific perception of facts, which is oversimplifying things. Of course, it's an ancient country, but what does it mean? It doesn't mean very much. It went through so radical changes that people who would say Ethiopia is a creation of the last 100 years are equally right as those people who say it's an ancient country. In some cases, of course, the change of borders, in case of some countries, the change of borders was more dramatical than in other cases, in other countries. But also this has not to be overestimated. The change of borders has been radical and dramatic in any country which we know in the world, starting from Egypt. Today's borders of Egypt have nothing to do with ancient Egypt, or not much to do with ancient Egypt, while even the Nile Valley is, of course, the core. In Ethiopia, the core of Ethiopian history is the Ethiopian highlands, 1,000, 1,200, 1,400 meters high. This is the area of the most dense population. This is about 25 to 35% of the territory of Ethiopia, depending on what you include into the highlands, where you have this great core of ancient populations of Ethiopia, while other parts of Ethiopia are settled by people of different ethnic background, linguistic background, and very often having been marked by totally different histories in plural form. Strangely, the word history is usually used only in singular form, not in plural form. Again, something which is very difficult to understand, but because even if we speak of the history of a country, we very quickly discover, again in any country, again in any case, that the country doesn't have history, but the country has histories, not only in the sense of stories, but in the sense of different regions having gone through different political organizations, different political experiences, including wars, famine, drought, migrations, political upheavals, or political stability within the same borders. So history of a country is again a concept which does not make much sense. It makes sense to some degree, but it's again overestimated. So we have to look into the regions, into the populations, into the different ecological settings of each region to understand the history of a region, and which always means the histories. And that is related with my profession. I'm not a classical historian. I'm not a classical social anthropologist. I'm an ethnohistorian. So I'm combining the study of local populations, of regions, and their social, political, and cultural setup with a perspective, a historical perspective, with a time perspective, trying to understand what is stable about these societies, how they construct the historical narratives, how they construct the historical narratives also against each other in cases of conflict, and how these societies remember history. Very simply, remember history in the sense of preservation of facts, but also in the sense of preservation of narratives and interpretations which are important for that society. So that's the ethnohistory. Ethnohistory looks into the settings, the historical narratives of specific societies, not necessarily within a specific state border, which is, as I tried to explain before, always totally modern. Modern boundaries are a little bit misleading if we study the history of regions, history of populations. Boundaries in the modern sense are modern because they result out of treaties, war treaties, after wars, agreements, whatsoever, in rather modern times. I think internationally, without almost any exception. Africa is not an exception, even if it's generally believed that African boundaries are artificial, while other boundaries may be less artificial. I don't understand it, because all boundaries have a high degree of artificiality in the sense of having resulted out of agreements, lines drawn on maps, and so on. But what is the difference between some of the older boundaries and modern boundaries, such as many boundaries within Africa, is something very simple. If boundaries are not agreed by the two parties living on each side of a boundary, the boundary becomes unstable. The boundary is not artificial, all are artificial, but the boundary is not well defined in the sense of accepted claims, accepted spheres of influence by those people who are found on each side of a boundary. So it doesn't make sense to call boundaries artificial. That's a perspective which is based on historical narrative. I remind you, I'm speaking of historical narratives in my lecture, in the sense that any boundary had been drawn at some point in history by people agreeing, and sometimes these people who agree do not represent the populations in that area. This doesn't make the boundary natural or artificial. It makes it a result of a political process. And this political process is sometimes unstable, based on violent impositions. So this boundary is simply unstable, not because it's artificial, but because it is not enrooted in appropriate procedures. That's it, nothing more. So this leads me to a number of core narratives which are marking the history and historical debates within the Horn of Africa. I think enough of theoretical setting. I want to start first with a general outlook, and then going into some examples, some details, which I have prepared for today. As I said, I will compare Ethiopia and Eritrea, among others. Let me first start with the big state narratives of Ethiopia and of Eritrea, at least the state narratives which dominate large parts of political elites, intellectual elites. Large parts means not all. Yeah, it must be clear. There's no unified state narrative of Eritrea. There's no unified state narrative of Ethiopia. There is many voices, but there is tendencies of narratives which tend to which dominate. So there's a tension and a tendency of domination by specific narratives. I would say this is true for any country, but again, it's very important to understand that the plurality of voices is something totally normal for any country, for any discussion on history. There is not one history of one country, and it also means there's not one history telling of one country. Just for clarification. But of course, there is narratives which dominate. In the case of Ethiopia, I mentioned already one aspect which I shortly explained, the idea that Ethiopia has a history of 3,000 years. You know, similar narratives about China, about ancient Egypt. In the case of ancient Egypt, it is 5,000 years, for example, or you can of course go much further back. But the dynastic history, people would rather suggest something like 5,000 years. So there is sort of this idea of big continuity. And a country which is marked by ancient tradition and heritage of a core population linked with monuments, linked with ancient writing systems, very often adopt such narratives of creating this kind of insanity of its own identity. This is the case of Ethiopia. Even if modern Ethiopia, in its boundaries of today, is about 3 times bigger than Ethiopia only 120, 140 years ago, approximately, especially 140 years ago, Ethiopia was just about 30% of what is Ethiopia today, in its established boundaries, in its traditional boundaries, not something at some short point in history. So there is a radical change, but this radical change doesn't play a role in the public narrative. In the public narrative, the idea is there's this ancient Ethiopia. All the big and dramatic changes of the rather recent past are not part of the narrative. So you see already the inner contradiction, which comes up the moment you study history, you study the sources. You see the narrative of Ethiopia as a very ancient entity doesn't fit into what you see within the boundaries of today's Ethiopia. Within the boundaries of today's Ethiopia, you have 80 ethnic groups, linguistic groups, some of them interconnected, connected also in the sense of political economic alliances as a sort of cluster groups. Within the Gurage, for example, there's a number of groups who identify with each other in a sort of alliance while speaking different languages within one related cluster, which is this Gurage cluster is an ethnic cluster south of central Ethiopia. There are other groups which are very, very big and which are a result of a long political development under the domination of one language. One example is Amhara. Amhara is the group of about, let's say, 30 million people. There's, of course, always a lot of debates about correct numbers, but let's say 30 million, maybe a little bit less, of Amhara population, which means people living in the highlands speaking Amharic. But are Amhara an ethnic group? If we look at the history, we see that those people who speak Amhara are very often of very different origins, have strong regional identities, but identify with the Ethiopian state, which in their area is really quite ancient, different from some other areas of Ethiopia. So the Amhara are very often those people who have lived over generations in an area dominated by the historical ancient Ethiopian state, whose leaders spoke Amharic. And the fact that the leaders spoke Amharic has also had the effect that local populations who did not speak Amharic slowly adapted Amharic and switched into Amharic identity and specific regional and Amharic identity. But Amharic identity not in the sense of a strong ethnic group, but in the sense of a linguistic group identifying with the state. So Amhara are not an ethnic group, but they're a sort of ethno-regional group or ethno-political group in a larger sense. Like the Polish population would be something like an ethno-political group identifying with the state, practicing the Polish language as the dominant language of Poland, same as Germans, who would also be something like an ethno-political group, while they are all of them composed of very different regional identities, very different even origins, migrations, and so on. So there are some of these very big groups who are those who are, let's say, those who own a state or believe to own a tradition and a historical narrative of a state, or who identify with political elites of a state, and these are, it's very difficult to put them under the term ethnic group. However, there's also very small groups who speak some isolated languages in a small remote area, who did not participate much in state affairs. These also exist in Ethiopia. But if we look into the history of Ethiopia, this core of Ethiopia in the central and northern highlands of today's Ethiopia, we see that in that period, before this huge expansion about 140 years ago, the ethnic groups of Ethiopia, or let's say the ethno-regional groups of Ethiopia, were about 3 or 4. So there were the Amhara speakers, the Tigrinya speakers as the two main groups close to the state structure, while the Amhara elites were much closer to the state structures. The Tigrayans in the north had their own local autonomies. Not only Tigrayans, but Tigrinya speakers in a larger sense had their own autonomous structures and had their own dynasties, but sometimes participating more closely, sometimes more remotely in the state structure of ancient Ethiopia. Then there were some subgroups, especially in remoter areas, which spoke and speak until today a Cushitic language. This is the Agau people. This is a rather small minority in these historical mainlands. That's the three main groups of historical Ethiopia, with some spots of other groups, including in some border regions and some core regions of the Ethiopian kingdoms or princedoms of the highlands, like the kingdom of Shoa, some Oromo groups, who are another Cushitic groups, also in some areas of Gojam. So this is the fourth group. There's very small spots of other groups which almost didn't participate in the entire state structure, which belong to border areas. So it's even doubtful if we can call them groups which were part of the Ethiopian state. This includes, for example, neighboring lowlanders who were often victims of slave raiding by the highlanders. So they were rather borderland inhabitants than people who were part of the state structure itself. But if we look at Ethiopia today, 80 groups. So you see this expansion 140 years ago has totally changed the character of the entire region. So to come back to one starting point, when we look at a country and understand that it is an ancient country, we tend to believe mainly and listen mainly to the narrative of ancientity, the narrative of the ancient state, and tend to overlook all these factors which may tell us a totally different story. So this was one detailed comment on the dominating narrative of Ethiopia being an ancient state. Now I add some more details. In ancient times, there was the kingdom of Aksum. The kingdom of Aksum, there is a lot of debate on its dates, but let's say it existed something like in the 1st century BC to maybe 9th century AD or a little bit before. There's a lot of debate. But the period of flourishing of this late antique kingdom was, let's say, 2nd century AD to 6th century AD. That's the time from which we have names of kings. We have plenty of sources, including inscriptions in different languages. We have foreign sources, later sources in Arabic, but sources of that time in Greek, for example, but also in Sabaic, in South Arabian inscriptions, mentioning some of the actors of that time. We have local inscriptions, which in the Ge'ez script, which even in an archaic Ge'ez script, which is related to the South Arabian script, and so on. We have a huge set of sources. including even coins. International coinage was something known to the Aksumites, used by the Aksumites, and they participate in the international flow of money exchange. We find Aksumite coins of late antiquity in Israel, in India, and other way around. We have even a hoard find of Kushana coins from ancient India in today's highland Tigray, which illustrates the great international importance of Aksum. We have even Persian sources mentioning Aksum as one of the world powers, which was the case for a short period of time in the sense of control of trade routes. The Aksumite kingdom was located nearby the Red Sea trade route, and at the south of the Nile River trade routes. They didn't control much of the Nile, but they controlled some of the southern areas of the Nile. So they had a number of entrance points of trade routes, which they controlled at some point, even in the sense that they controlled both sides of the Red Sea. I don't go into details here. It's enough to mention that they were a power whose center was in the today's Ethiopian northern highlands, mainly Tigray, part of central Eritrea, part of what is today Wollo in Amhara, central parts of Ethiopia. This was the core region, and within this core region, there were sometimes very strong kings with armies who could be sent even into remote areas, such as into Sudanese border regions. In one case, we have clear proof that these armies moved even into the area of Meroe, the ancient kingdom of ancient Sudan, of Nubia, which in that time collapsed. And we have a lot of data on the Aksumite armies moving across the Red Sea on the other side, into South Arabia, into the area which is today Yemen. So this is what we have. And this Aksumite period is known to the Greeks. It's known to other powers of the world. I mentioned you a number of sources, including Persian. We do have even Tang Dynasty Chinese sources already mentioning the area. So it's quite amazing, this great set of sources telling us about a late antiquity kingdom in northeastern Africa. Of course, important for world history. So it is evident that historical narratives will refer to that. And they always did over centuries. It's not something which is discovered today by researchers or by politicians. It is something which has marked historical debate, I would say, during the last 1,000 years, easily. And of course, starting from the demise of the Aksumite kingdom, we can assume that immediately from then, historical memory was used by leaders, by descendants of kings, descendants of noble families, by local populations who were aspiring in reviving that period of splendor. Also within power struggles, it would make sense to claim that you are a descendant of Aksumite kings in order to win political sympathies against another claimant to the throne or claimant of central power, or a power over the control of trade routes and the control of land rent. Because part of the strength of the Ethiopian system was that its dense population of peasants who organized themselves based on local law codices, on local systems of law, complex social-political systems with local dynasties, local councils of elders. This is some of the things which I have tried to study, and I have found a number of very complex systems of self-organization in different regions, in some areas for even totally autonomous, in a sort of in societies which remind me of the societies of the Swiss mountains, which you don't expect probably in Africa. In other areas, you have strong princedoms under a prince who is controlling the peasants' lands. So according to region, you have very different systems, sometimes protected by the fact that they are high mountains and it's not easy to control such kind of diverse societies protected by mountains, but interlinked with trade routes. So what was important in the power struggle was the access to at least some sort of basic taxation of these peasant lands, providing a political framework in the sense also of setting up armies against possible invaders. So there was a common interest of protection, but there was also a common interest in protection of internal self-organization, internal autonomy. So a king had to be strong to some degree, strong enough to unify, to create a sort of larger framework within taxation was accepted, but also in the sense of protecting local autonomies so that people would not be disturbed by the king. This was a precarious balance. Sometimes kings were rather seen as invaders by local populations, which regularly resulted into rebellions. I think in this case, the similarity with the Swiss mountains is not so far. It's not so far. Due to this ecological situation, societies tend to develop a high degree of self-organization. So over centuries, these kings, in their competition, in their power competition, tended to claim Aksumite descent. Now, there was one crucial moment. In the high medieval age, there was a shift between two dynasties. I don't assume that you know and you need to know the details of Ethiopian history. That's why I make it simple. There was the so-called Zagwe dynasty, which was based in an early medieval area, an early medieval dynasty called Zagwe dynasty. Was based in an area in the today's northern central highlands of Ethiopia. And they were competing with a dynasty which was based slightly further south, which was mainly Amharic speaking. This later so-called Solomonic dynasty. So within this power struggle, some of the local monasteries set up an important manuscript. The manuscript called Kibr Negest. Kibr Negest, if you want to translate it, means the glory of the kings. And it is a huge historical narrative. Kibr Negest, the glory of the kings, of course, tells the story as it was supposed to be told from the point of view of the kings. You know it from other manuscript traditions all over the world where you have royal systems. This creation of manuscripts telling the story of the king, not only in the sense of telling the names of the rulers, giving summaries of the time of their rule, but also creating stories of legitimization. And in short, what is the story of legitimization of the Kibr Negest? They say these Shoan kings, who were about in that time to win the power struggle against the Zagwe kings, they said, according to the Kibr Negest, they said, we are descendants of King Solomon of Israel, whose descendants were the kings of Aksum, whose descendants were displaced and took refuge in Shoa, in the southern areas of the Ethiopian highlands. And now we are claiming back power. What is the structure of that narrative? The structure is, I remind you, Ethiopia is marked by ancient Christianity. I mentioned all these churches, which were also the center of manuscript traditions. They were the depositories of knowledge, of historical narratives, of hagiographies, and so on. So in these centers, there was, of course, knowledge about ancient Aksum. There were manuscript traditions, for sure, which were quite ancient. We have proof of existence of manuscripts already in Aksumite times. There's even one debatable two manuscripts which date based on C14 analysis, but which are dated back to Aksumite times. So we do have an ancient manuscript tradition. So of course, there was also memory of the kings of Aksum. In some cases, we have distorted names of kings. If we compare them with coins, we can reconstruct many of these kings which are mentioned in manuscripts and reconstruct the original names. In some cases, we cannot. the names which are found in manuscripts simply do not fit into the coinage. But now what comes? Because they were Christian, it made sense to link the descent not only with the Aksumite kings, which by itself was already a strong narrative of legitimization, but to link their identity even with King Solomon. In fact, if we look into historical memories and historical sources, we do see some elements of migration along the Red Sea, especially from southern Arabia to Ethiopia and back. So there was a back and forth migration. We have a number of indications for that. We do have connections with the Sudanese regions, with the Nubian areas. Again, probably a back and forth connection. We do have sources which suggest very far away migrations and contacts, including Israel. So there is, of course, a memory. There's a memory of presence of Sabaeans, the so-called Sabawian in Ethiopian tradition, who were in South Arabia. We do have memories of contacts with Israel. So based on these memories of contacts, it would make sense to claim a biblical story. In the Bible, it is mentioned very shortly that the Queen of Saba was usually called Sheba in English. I don't know why, but it is Saba. And this queen met King Solomon. Now that's all what we find in the Bible, but meeting, what does it mean? The Ethiopian stories make something very dramatic out of it. She got pregnant. There's a complex story behind. She got pregnant, went back to, and that's the Ethiopian story, to Ethiopia. So she gave birth to a son, and this son became the founder of the dynasty which ruled Ethiopia throughout Aksumite times until even the 1970s. Emperor Haile Selassie himself claimed to be the descendant of that dynasty. So you have a huge, huge narrative. This narrative is based on the idea that the rulers of Ethiopia are descendants of King Solomon of Israel, which also implies that the kings of Ethiopia are the heirs of ancient Israel in the biblical sense. And this implies another idea, the transfer of, let me call it, selectedness, closeness to God, to use a rather neutral term, closeness to God, inherited it from ancient Israel. There's this story, it's a Christian tradition, it's an anti-Judaistic tradition, which in some cases shifted into anti-Semitic traditions, that the Jews have lost their status towards God. So another people who have kept closeness to God in the sense of following the Messiah, in the sense of following Jesus, instead of rejecting him, these people are those who have gained the new closeness to God, to use this rough and neutral terminology. So this claim is there in the Ethiopian tradition. So through the descent of King Solomon, they had a sort of story of legitimacy, not only to the Aksumites, but to Solomon himself, which made them even relatives of Jesus himself, because Jesus himself was from the house of King David. So you have a huge story there. If we look into historical facts, things become, in a way, simple, in a way. If we look into the names of Aksumite kings, the inscriptions and so, Solomon never appears. They sometimes mention their descent. If we look into inscriptions of Sabaic kings, Solomon never appears. Even the Queen Saba doesn't appear. What appears is queen mothers or female co-rulers. Maybe it's a difficult thing to decide based on the inscriptions of Sabaic kings, male kings. This is what we have in the sources. Nothing Solomonic. And the set of inscriptions is quite dense. We have, from the core periods, we have a lot of sources on these kings. Sometimes they also claim descent from Maharam. Maharam was a Semitic god. Again, no Solomon. So we clearly see that ancient pieces of tradition, like a connection with the Sabaeans on the other side of the Red Sea, like the ancient trade relations, which certainly include some, at least minor, migration relations with Israel and Egypt and so on, could be used to be reinterpreted into a dynastic relationship with ancient Israel, a powerful narrative. Until today, especially Ethiopian highlanders tend to believe that this is a historical fact, even if we compare it with existing historical sources. As I said, they are very dense, which clearly suggests that this was a political fabrication within a power struggle. Very easy to understand. We have this kind of factor in any country. But all this together creates a very strong identity narrative. So we see, and that's what I want to say, in the construction of these historical narratives as political tools, we see that elements from history, which we can prove as being based on real historical phenomena, these elements of history are used and recombined, sometimes in a very poetic, in a very convincing way, within a specific ideological setting, to create a new narrative which appears ancient. So we have an ongoing, steady process of creation of ancient stories, which are really based on ancient elements, but which are part of a totally modern political setting. Now let's look at Eritrea. And after that, I give some further examples and we'll finish the lecture and we'll open to discussion. Give me a little bit time for that. So about Eritrea. They have no understanding for this Ethiopian narrative. The Ethiopian identity, if we base our assumption or our description of Ethiopian identity on the highlands narratives, then we see that the Ethiopian narrative is very much based on this identity of an ancient history. If we look at Eritrean identity and state narratives, everything changes. In Eritrea has been created in 1890 by the Italian colonialists. If we look into the details of history, we see that the coastal lands were dominated over centuries by the Ottoman Empire, usually in a quite indirect way, not in the sense of strong control, but with local rulers, local group rulers, appointed people, but with a high degree of autonomy, but keeping the link to the Ottoman Empire along the Red Sea coast over centuries and centuries and centuries, while the highlands were based on this high degree of self-organization of the highland peasants societies, which I described in the first part of my lecture, which had developed a high degree of legalized self-organization with their own dynasties, with their own intermarriages, political marriages, and so on, with the ruler, the king of kings of Ethiopia, being very far away, usually receiving some tribute, which we know from sources, but except that, not interfering much and heavily into the internal affairs of this population. So this is the reality of the Eritrean highlands if we look into history. In the middle of the 19th century, especially from the 1860s, these Ottoman coastal areas were taken over by imperialist Egypt. In that time, Egypt was heavily expanding. You know that Egypt in the 1840s had taken over most of Sudan and was further expanding into the border areas of Ethiopia. They also expanded into the coastal areas of the Red Sea. So this was the situation when the European colonialists entered into the political plays and competitions over territory in that area. The Egyptians collapsed for economic reasons in the 1880s. The Italians came in and took over the Egyptian territory, which was based on the older Ottoman territory, and local groups which were basically autonomous groups, self-ruling groups, sometimes linked with Ethiopia in the past, but already had broken that link, and the highlanders who didn't have a strong relationship with the Ethiopian rulers, so which were linked, and Eritrea was created. You see, it's a conglomerate of different identities, and again, even if it's a small country along the Red Sea coast, south of Sudan, and northwest of Djibouti and of Somalia, this is a small country. Even if it's a small country, you have quite a number of different histories. So there is no basis for an ancient narrative. So what you see very often in the state narratives of Eritrea is the narrative of resistance, the narrative of foreign domination. Especially in state media, you see that we Eritreans have suffered again and again from marginalization by great powers moving into our territory, like imperialist Egypt, like expanding Ethiopia, taking over our lands. This is true. In the 1880s especially, a governor was set over the Eritrean highlands, who was directly dependent on the Ethiopian emperor. This was in a time when Ethiopia entered into modern international weapons trade and was becoming stronger and stronger, which was also the basis for Ethiopian expansion into southern territories. So in that time, Ethiopia had also established more control of the Eritrean highlands, while of course they were part of the entire ancient Ethiopian setting. But I insist on the basis of a strong local autonomy. All sources confirm that. But in the Eritrean narrative, in the modern narrative, it is rather this idea of resistance of local populations against invading powers. So you see that there is truth in it, a lot of truth in it. But it is based on a specific political narrative which creates a framework of not an ancient identity in the sense of unified territory, but of an ancient identity. And here we have again something ancient, but in a totally different way, an ancient identity of resistance and suffering, and an identity of marginalization from which finally the Eritreans have liberated themselves. You see, this is two identities of two territories who are direct neighbors, who are diametrically opposing each other. And in the time of Eritrean-Ethiopian wars, but also in the time of the recent war between Ethiopia and the regional state of Tigray, with involvement of the neighboring Eritrean state, such narratives and local contradictions and local interpretations of history have played an enormous role. These historical narratives cannot come together, except if it is accepted that the state narrative of Eritrea is based on a modern colonial creation. It's simply to be accepted as a fact, and that based on this experience of living within these state boundaries, there was a history of building up of an identity of local populations working with each other, based again of an ancient tradition of local interconnections. So if we accept this, there's no problem. If in Ethiopia we simply say, okay, there are these narratives, but mainly there's local ancient autonomous populations who sometimes define their relationship with the state in a conflictual way, okay, no problem. This is now the details. But if we look into the big narratives, we have the idea of an ancient Ethiopia who is dominant, has been dominant in the past, and this is very often linked with political narratives today of dreams of re-establishing the imperial glory of the past, which as such has never existed. But speaking of imperial glory of the past is an instrument of political conflict, political domination, and we can very clearly say it's a very good instrument of leading war. So that's what you see. History telling creates a framework, first of narratives, and as a second step, a framework of political identification, as a third step, as a framework for political emotion. And anything which happens, which goes against the assumptions of the narrative, is seen as an act of enmity, as an act of aggression. So here is the problem of the use of such instruments. So if the narrative is not accepted by someone outside the narrative, you very often tend to get into a conflictual situation. And this makes these historical narratives such powerful political instruments. To come now to the last examples, I mentioned that in modern times you still have examples, you still have a number of other stories popping up, coming into existence, being used, being created. This is also true for the regions which were not part of this historical Ethiopia which I have described. An example are the Oromo. The Oromo people are the greatest population of Ethiopia. They are Cushitic-speaking people. Their number is much higher than the number of Amhara, who are except the Oromo, the strongest group in Ethiopia, and they are the strongest group within the Ethiopian highlands, within the ancient Ethiopian state. And the Oromo have gone through a situation, especially during the last 140 years after the expansion of Ethiopia into much of their territories, most of their territories. They have gone through a modern history of marginalization. While they are the main group of the modern Ethiopian state, they are absolutely not the main group of the historical Ethiopian state, where most of the Oromo lived outside the Ethiopian state, with some small groups within this historical Ethiopian state. So there were no structures of making them participate in these state structures. The state structures then, based on the modern weapons trade, which I mentioned before, was able to quickly expand into far away territories all over the Horn of Africa and included large numbers of groups. The main group who were included in the late 19th century were the Oromo. However, if we look into the history of the Oromo, very short, we see a number of kingdoms, especially in the west of Oromo territories and southwest of Oromo territories. You have for example, the Jimma kingdom, which was a very important trading kingdom with some strong Muslim element, but not exclusively, interacting with Sudanese territories, other territories, Omotic kingdoms further south, which are also included into Ethiopia today, but were not part of Ethiopia in those times before 140 years, but were very active, politically active kingdoms, even exchanging diplomatic missions among each other. So in the southwest, you had this set of a number of sometimes small, sometimes bigger kingdoms interacting with each other, intermarrying, also intermarrying with the huge Ethiopian state. In comparison, the Ethiopian state was huge, but not as huge as today. So there was a network of interconnections of different kingdoms. In further south and into the east, you had non-kingdom territories. Difficult to find a name for them. In some cases, you can call them something like, if it's more highlands, peasants' republics. In some cases, tribal, even if the word tribal is very problematic, tribal societies with complex political systems of self-organization through councils of elders, specific leadership structures. I don't go into detail here. Just you understand, there was an extreme political diversity also among the Oromo. Some Oromo had kings, other Oromo didn't have. They had a sort of democratic system of self-rule in a more ancient sense, democratic in a more ancient sense, not in a very modern sense. So, but within the modern Ethiopia, the Oromo who entered into the Ethiopian state areas in the sense of entering into the cities, looking for jobs, having chances to get into trade relations, they had to face the reality that they had to change their identity, speak Amharic, even take names of the Ethiopian highlanders in order to get accepted. That was the one side. So a small group interacted through co-opting themselves into the state system, while the great majority was not co-opted, they were rather becoming dependent peasants or dependent people who had even no full right of land, because the victorious state of Ethiopia imposed governors who again imposed heavy taxation. So the general historical experience is the one of exploitation, depending on the region, of quite different level. We have to understand that. But this again evidently leads into resistance. And what is an important instrument of expressing resistance? Historical narratives. So within the Oromo elites, there was a strong tendency of creating narratives of Oromumma, of the idea of interconnection of all Oromo territories. Again, I cannot go into detail. Some part of it is based on ancient traditions of interconnection, intermarriage. Some part of it is totally exaggerated, because you did have a multitude of different states within Oromo, with their own state leaderships, with sometimes very hierarchical structures, sometimes even being at war against each other. But in a setting of necessary resistance, you would rather focus on a story of unity. This is continuing until today. So the result is that within Ethiopia, and I conclude with this because there's so many other examples, but you have understood with these examples the main point. You have now historical narratives within the Horn of Africa which exclude each other. There's the idea of ancient Oromo unity, which had been crushed by the Ethiopian state. While within the Ethiopian state, especially the older elites in the center, you have the idea of an ancient regime which is unifying all the territories under in a sort of process of renaissance, in the process of restoration of ancient splendor, of ancient glory, in the sense of Kibra Nagast, in the sense of the glory of the kings, continuing these narratives of ancienity of Ethiopia. So there is a lack of recognition of each other within the historical narratives themselves. So to conclude with the last phrase, we have to make sure as researchers to free history from historical narratives, while understanding that historical narratives are always marking all of our research and are a social and a cultural factor. But we have to understand that as long as history is used by political leaders and for political identity creation, they are rather instruments of conflict and not instruments of understanding of the real diversity of political systems on the ground. Enough for now. I'm happy if there's any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting, I think, not only for those who are interested in Ethiopian and Eritrean history. Yes, I can see already there is a question from Dr. Nagmelin Karamala. Your microphone is off.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Professor Hannah. And thank you, Wolbert, for this interesting lecture. My question is, the many Sudanese researchers and as well as African researchers, they think that the conflict of the religion and nationalism did not erupt throughout the history of Ethiopia, as they erupt in the area of Meles Zenawi. So Zenawi, who led the liberation of the Ethiopia from the dictatorship of the Mengistu Haile Mariam, was a great dictator in turn, and he ruled Ethiopia for about 20 years, okay, which is a longer period than the period that Mengistu ruled in the conflict within his colleagues. So Zenawi did everything. They see many researchers that Menawi did everything that Mengistu did. These are the same things. Zenawi use politics and weapons, and Mengistu use the weapons. They are saying, or researcher. Do you agree with that, Professor?
That's more a political question than a question on historical narratives. That's why it needs a very thorough discussion. It's not easy. But to make it short, if we compare within modern Ethiopian history the different regimes, we see, and you're right with that, continuities of violence. I agree. I do not agree if you say that he did the same. That's part of political debates, and one typical historical narrative structure, which by itself says those in the center are always violent. It's not as simple as that. It's just not true. They're all violent, true. Political leadership structures, especially in the Horn of Africa, tend to resort to systems of manipulation and oppression. I agree. But if you look into details, they are amazingly different. They are so different that the systems of oppression are sometimes so different that those who belong to the system of before are surprised about how different the rulership is. So in the case of the Tigrayan system, it was very much based, I say Tigrayan system, even it was not Tigrayan system, but based on the system of Meles Zenawi, the EPRDF system, which was dominated by the Tigrayan party, but not exclusively. That's always important to understand. This was based on the system of federalism, and the system of federalism was again a response to this incredible political multitude of the entire region, while the system of oppression, and we can call it like that, of the military dictator Mengistu Haile Mariam, under the cover-up of socialist narratives, was based very much on military interventionist central regime. So there's already a very fundamental difference of structures, and also the methods of oppression were different. But anyway, if we conclude, yes, we do have a quite strong continuity of 140 years of strengthening of state structures, starting from Emperor Menelik in the late 19th century to his successor Haile Selassie, later the Mengistu, later Meles Zenawi, later Abiy Ahmed. We have a continuity of different state systems, which very quickly include also instruments of oppression and include instruments of manipulation of historical narratives. Here we have very often different narratives. The narrative of the Meles Zenawi period, of the EPRDF period, was very much based on oppression of people who had to resist against a violent center, which justified federalism. Then again, while this narrative is not so far from historical facts, this again was used to justify a new system, and this was the system of the so-called developmental state. So, due to the marginalization of all these groups by a violent central state, now these groups have to be empowered. But now the idea was not to empower them in the sense of political democracy, but to empower them in the sense of economic development. But who knows about the economic development? It's the technocrats of the center. So, in a secret way, while establishing a federal model, again, we are back into a center, but a center of technocrats, which try to dominate the economic development of the country, based on the narrative of local oppressed groups who have to be empowered through economic development, which again has to be directed from a center who is responsible for the developmental state. So you have a very strong inner contradiction. But you see, this kind of system is quite different from the system before. But I should stop here. This is about modern developments, but we are here about talking about historical narratives.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, but I come
narratives. Yes,
I have another question, but after this, Mr. Krzysztof. Okay. Thank
yes, I think it was Dr. Błażewicz who raised his hand. So now, please, it's your turn to ask a question.
Okay. Thank you, Wolbert. for nice introduction to this narrative history and propaganda, which is based on the narrative history for two influential parties on Ethiopian history from the point of Eritrea, which is, like you mentioned, is based on the history of conflict of the region built, because according people who make research of this conflict between Eritrea and it's much more based in the time of colonial system, and this because it was as well is some influential between lords or people who was rule of the some parts of the actual Eritrea, like Bahr Negesh, like Hamazian, and Hamazian quite often was too opposite to kings of Tigray because of the family relation with a dynasty, Solomonic dynasty from Gondarian period. So it's interesting, but I think that this relation between people is much closer and than this political narration, yes, when we have a private conversation about it. And as well, we should mention about this, that between Tigray population, ethnic population, which is most population of Eritrea actually, and Tigray, where it's about 90% of Tigray population. The connection and the connection historical and familiar in family, intermarriage connection as well. The people who try oppressed the traditional Tigray population, they remove from territory of Eritrea the elites of rulers. That was done by Italian, because they quite often created rebels against Italian, supported by Johannes or later by Menelik. They as well forced to move to Ethiopia the high clergy of Ethiopian Orthodox Church from some influential monasteries like Debrecen. And was quite easy, created new narrative politic, which the standards of this narrative politic of colonial time is actually EPLF with Isaias Afwerki. And as well, I can't agree about this Oromo, yes? Oromo from 16th century, if you read some manuscripts, for example, which I was translated of one of the abbot of Gundagundi monastery, which was living in very turbulent time in 16th century. The Oromo reached even Red Sea, because in this manuscript it's mentioned that it's time in 16th century they reached Debrecen and Gundagundi monastery. Usually, they were quite influential people on the Solomonic dynasty from the Gondarian system, because between the intermarriage relation of Wiedź, Oromo, with Gondarian period Solomonic dynasty. And as well in Shah, which was mixed groups, Amhara and Oromo, they quite easily were incorporated to Ethiopian culture with language, yes, which is huge problem now in Ethiopia, because some of the Oromo, they don't identify from Shoa with Oromo, because they don't know language, and most of them are Orthodox Christian. And this is huge problem, which is, I think, I don't see create one Oromo country like would like to do it some nationalists or ethnic nationalists in Ethiopia. And I have to agree with Dr. Nagmeldin that in my eyes, in many Ethiopians' eyes, and special people who are educated from intelligent families or historical families, the period of EPRDF, or what Ethiopian calls it Ihadek, it was one of the tragic for Ethiopian history because they based on many instruments which was created by Derg, special for control of society, and build up huge service people who reported, who served for this government, for this institution of EPD. This is why could rule Ethiopia 27 years. Thank you very much. I really love your explanation, and I really admire you, my friend. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Let me make this short because there are so many topics now, impossible to enter into the discussion as needed. But one, yes, local populations were strongly interconnected. You have it all over Ethiopia, but according to region in different ways. The ways of interconnection, however, were based on a lot of local systems of autonomy. So interconnections, yes, but linked with a lot of difference, including difference of language, difference of social political self-organization, and the same, and so on. Even today, people very often say in Eritrea there was the Bahar Nagash, in Tigray there was the Tigray Mokonnen, the leader of Tigray, and so on, and it's an ancient competition. To some degree it's true, but really only to some degree. Even if we look into the details, we see until the 16th century, yes, there was a very strong Bahar Nagash, which means the so-called king of the sea, or which means the king who is controlling the ways or the routes to the sea. Yes, at some points he was strong, but very often there were local dynasties who were not Bahar Nagash, but controlling, for example, Hamasin, not controlling Akaluguzai. Again, Akaluguzai had its own local leadership structures. If we look into Tigray, we had not only the Tigray Mokonnen, we had the Shum Adamen, we had the Shum Temben, depending on the historical period, you had a sort of complex set of peasants' republics, princedoms in the north, sometimes competing with each other, sometimes interconnected. So a dynamic set of local regions with a high degree of autonomy, redefining their interaction all the time. The historical narrative is today that there was the big Tigray and the big area of the Bahar Nagash, which correspond to Tigray today and to Eritrea today. That doesn't correspond to history. So it's closer to what you say, that the local populations had a lot of interconnections, but insist based on local systems of which were very different from each other. Everyone having a certain degree of autonomy in his or their territory. So not more on that. On the Oromo, yes, of course, you are absolutely right. The important Oromo groups entered into Ethiopian highlands, and especially during the Yeju dynasty, which I didn't mention here, they were very important players within Ethiopian politics. This was especially after the influx of important Oromo groups into the Ethiopian highlands. True, but large parts of these Oromo groups quickly got absorbed by this Ethiopian state. And even if the Yeju dynasty had a strong Oromo background, we also can conclude that it interacted with the Amhara traditions and entered into the Ethiopian system, while large parts, and this is my point, large parts of today's Oromo population are those who lived in territories outside this historical Ethiopia. That's important to be understood. So this idea of Oromo being unified leads to a lot of problems. There are some Oromo who participated in the historical Ethiopian state, as you mentioned. Many other Oromo regions participated in totally different settings, political settings, including the kingdoms in southwest of Ethiopia, from today's Wolaga to Jimma, to the borders of the kingdom of Kaffa. Very different states, or Borana, which are based on a sort of traditional democracies. So there is an extreme diversity. However, and this is now the interesting point, and let me conclude with that interesting point. Today's elites within Oromo are claiming an ancient unity to develop an instrument of political resistance against a dominant state, which is potentially and historically a rather violent state. So you have the reality of an experience of marginalization and in some areas, heavy oppression, in some other areas, rather remoteness, so de facto marginalization. It's not always the same kind of oppression, but there is this reality of a rather violent state. So you create a counter-narrative against that state, a counter-narrative of an ancient unity of all these people. While the fact on the ground is an extreme diversity. If we look now into the big historical narrative of Ethiopia, the Ethiopian highlands, what is the big narrative? We have to recreate the splendor of ancient Ethiopia, where in the past everyone was unified, every ethnic group was collaborating with the other one. If we look into historical sources, totally wrong. It did not exist. We have not one historical source which suggests something like that. We do have historical narratives in the sense of political instruments who insist on that. But if we look into the history of regions, different political systems, high degree of autonomy, in some cases, an Ethiopian ruler taking power, sending his armies into regions, leading to long-term civil war. Yes, this we do have, but civil war is not unity. So there's something very interesting with these historical narratives. They are created as an instrument of creating a political aim, creating a political framework for a specific political aim, but based on an interpretation of history, which is rejecting difference and diversity, which is the real reality of the entire Horn of Africa. So we have a very strange situation of repeated historical creation of historical narratives by many populations in the region, creating a narrative of unity, while the local research always proves exactly the contrary. So we do not have one narrative which has a basis in history in this sense.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And still we have a question from Dr. Nagmelin Karamala.
Let's make it very shorter because I was giving long answers.
Yeah.
Let's have the question short and my answer short.
No problem. That's just a short because I'm curious. I would like to ask you about the comparing all the procedure and politicals in Sudan, in Africa, asking or comparing all the time the rule of creating the Sudanese rule of creating the state of Eritrea, comparing the rule of Ethiopia of creating the South Sudan. Do you see any kind of comparing here? And now in the future, if you see any kind of role, the Sudanese role in creating of the Tigray state in the future?
It's largely outside my topic of today. That's why maybe
I know, but I would like to know your opinion about this.
No, it's fine. I should put it into our private discussion when we meet. I hope we meet soon.
Yeah, of course.
But maybe in short, because if I stay within the topic of today, we see, for example, one thing in the Sudan which did not work as strongly as in Ethiopia. There was, of course, in the Sudan also this idea of belonging to each other, one Sudan, and there were, of course, ideas of ancient Sudan, not as strong as in Ethiopia, interestingly. And while there's also something similar, large parts of the Sudan are modern colonial additions to the Sudan. So, for example, South Sudan, of course, has nothing to do with ancient Sudan. Southern Ethiopia has nothing to do with ancient Ethiopia. Yeah, in this sense, Sudan and Ethiopia are very similar in this sense. What is different is in the Sudan, this strong rule of elites over large territories was not there because of the colonial setting, where the elites were mainly foreign. So Sudan didn't have enough time to concentrate infrastructure, weapons power, state administration within a small group of elites. So it was sort of easier, in a way, to break up again without continuing these narrative in a strong way. I would say that this is a difference. But this also means that in the Sudan, there is the potential probably to give up these historical narratives as a strong instrument. Just looking at the situation as it is today, and then based on this modern pragmatism, advise maybe neighboring regions, maybe Tigray, maybe other regions, to forget this very strong idea that history will have the solution. No, history doesn't have any solution. So that if we have a lesson from history, history doesn't have a solution. Especially if we refer to history as a model which we have to follow today, we can be sure we will be in war. That's it, as simple as that. So history only helps us in understanding the dynamics of societies, and helps us understand that political problems of today are similar to some historical settings, but so different that we cannot repeat these historical settings. That's the only lesson. So some part of Sudanese experience may be that it was not worth very much to stay within one big state, but maybe it's also not worth much to become independent. So it's probably maybe the lesson to become more pragmatic and in the exchange between Sudanese intellectuals and Ethiopian intellectuals, that may happen. A sort of dehistorization of the political debate would be my wish, but for the moment I don't see it.
Thank you. But just I would like to mention that this political issues from Sudan, this is have historical ground, of course. You know, we will discuss about that in the private show. Thank you so much for answering. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I can see no further questions, and we already used our time, so I will also keep myself from asking questions. So thank you very much once again for this fascinating talk and very nice discussion. Also I would like to invite you, and now in Polish, chciałabym Państwu przypomnieć, że kolejne seminarium afrykanistyczne będzie już w nowym roku, w styczniu, konkretnie 12 stycznia, i wtedy będą Państwo mieli okazję spotkać się z profesorem Kamilem Kuraszkiewiczem. Okay, so thank you very much and see you in January.
Dziękuję bardzo, do widzenia.
Do widzenia.